Sometimes we come across a problem that is still a quadratic, but it's a different form. It's a different scenario, and so we can use what's called the square root property. How the square root property is basically we're using the square root or an inverse operation to solve. So we're given this original equation. So we take this original equation, x squared equals 1156. And remember, our whole thought process here is this idea that if I can use an inverse operation to undo this. So the inverse of squaring something is to take the square root. If I do that to one side, I have to do the same thing to the other side. Now, a key thing to remember here is that my solution can be both positive or negative. On the left-hand side, now I'm left with, because a square and a square root cancel each other or undo each other, plus or minus the square root of 1156. Okay, so that's not done yet because we can simplify that out a little bit more. We'll come back to that, simplifying the radicals. Let's go to the next one. So we have x squared is equal to 8. So we square root both sides, square root both sides. Remember, it's positive or negative. So now we get x is equal to a positive or negative square root of 8. Now, let's use this guy as a springboard to understand what we have left right here. Inside of this radical, if we think about the 8, 8 can be broken down to 4 times 2, where 4 is a perfect square. So our actual solution set to this problem is a positive or negative 2 square roots of 2, because the square root of 4 is equal to 2, and the square root of 2 stays underneath. So these are my solutions, either a positive or a negative. So let's conquer that positive or negative conversation real quick. If I had x squared is equal to 9, that means that x could be equal to 3 or x could be equal to negative 3. Because a negative times a negative is a positive, and a positive times a positive is a positive. So that's why when we do this, we have to consider both the positive and negative version, is because of this thought right here. So that takes us back to our 1156. So if we pull out our calculator and we go to y equals, we do 1156 divided by x. We're looking for factors. We go to our table. We're looking for factors that are perfect squares. So, you might need to pull out your calculator and kind of see this, but I'm thinking, I'm just going to write it down over here, I'm thinking 578 is a good number. So I go back to my home screen, so second mode, see where it says quit right there? I say second square root of 578. I want to see if 578 is a perfect square. Nope. So I go back to my table, so second table. So that didn't work. So okay, so I see 4. 4 is definitely a perfect square. So what about 289? So 4 and 289. So I come back to my home screen and I say, okay, well, I know what the square root of 4 is. What's the square root of 289? So wait a second. 4, the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 289 is 17. What's the square root of 1156? So make sure you double check. Even though the radical is really large, double check to see. It might be a perfect square. It might just be so big that you don't have it memorized. All right, we move right along. Now we're going to approach some imaginary numbers. So you'll see why in just a minute. Imaginary. So now we're going to get some imaginary numbers. And with imaginary numbers, what I need you to keep in mind here is this idea of, when I take the square root, so I start off with x squared equals negative 169. I do my process. I use my square root property. I square root both sides. Don't forget your positive or negative. That gives us x is equal to a positive or negative square root of negative 169. So now, going back to our first video, our review of imaginary numbers, we know that negative 1 is equal to I squared. So whether you're ready to graduate or whether you still need this step, we've got to remember that at this point we got the square root. Remember that the negative turns into an I squared times 169. And now we can break it down from there. We've got our positive or negative. Square root of I squared. The square and the square root cancel. I get I. The square root of 169 is 13. So my final solution is x is equal to a positive or negative 13i. Okay, last one. I'm not quite in the right form yet. I've got to move that guy over. I've got to have the square on one side and the number on the other one. So when I approach this problem, I'm going to start off and I don't want to have a negative, so I'm going to move the t squared. So I move the t squared to the other side. So this becomes 18 is equal to t squared. And now I'm ready to go. Now I'm square root of this side. If I do it to one side, I got to do it to the other side. Don't forget your positive or negative. Square root and the square cancel. I get t is equal to. I know that the 19 or 18 breaks down to plus or minus the square root of 9 times 2, which is plus or minus 3 square roots of 2 is equal to t squared. All right. That'll take care of, that's a quick one on the square root property.